For 40 long years, the United States government ran a secret medical experiment on 400 of its own citizens. 400 black men who were told they were getting treatment for a deadly disease, but they were never giving a single drop of medicine. They were just being watched, as syphilis literally destroyed their bodies from the inside out. This is the story of what happens when the very institutions sworn to protect you, your government, your doctors, decide your life is worth less than their data. It's what happens when racism isn't just an attitude. It becomes official policy, hidden right there in plain sight.
You have to understand, they weren't patients. No, they were subjects. Their agony wasn't a tragedy that needed to be stopped. It was a phenomenon to be documented. Their bodies became living laboratories, left to rot for the sake of so-called science.
Okay, let's really get into this. To even begin to wrap your head around how a conspiracy this huge could even happen, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. The year is 1932. America is on its knees.
Think about the scene, the Great Depression. Banks are failing, people are starving in the streets. But underneath all that chaos, a hidden epidemic was just tearing through the country, and it was hitting the rural South the hardest. That epidemic was syphilis. And you really need to understand what this disease does to a person when you just let it run its course. It is a slow, methodical demolition of a human being. The first stage, it's just one sore, and then it disappears. It tricks you into thinking you're fine. But underneath, the bacteria is silently multiplying. The final stages, they're a complete nightmare. The disease literally eats away at the brain and the spinal cord. And that leads to blindness, crippling paralysis, total insanity, and finally, a very, very painful death. Now you have to remember, back in the 30s, there wasn't a real cure. The so-called treatments they had were these awful infusions of heavy metals. We're talking mercury and arsenic. These were poisons, plain and simple. Often, they were just as deadly as the disease they were supposed to be fighting. So a lot of people, and you can't blame them, were actually more afraid of the cure than they were of the illness itself.
And this is where the federal government enters the story. The U.S. Public Health Service decides to launch a study. Their stated goal? To observe the natural, unimpeded progression of the disease. But they didn't just pick a random sample of Americans. No, they went hunting. They specifically targeted a community in Macon County, Alabama, a population that was poor, that was rural, and that was overwhelmingly black. A population they believed had no voice and would never be heard. The official name was the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. They walked into these communities with a promise that, in the middle of the Depression, must have sounded like a miracle from God. Free medical care, from real government doctors. But it was all a calculated, monstrous lie. And right here, this is the deception at the very heart of the study. Look at this. The men were told they were being treated for something called bad blood, which was a local catch-all term for all sorts of sicknesses. But the classified objective, it was chillingly clear. Do not treat them. Give them placebos, sugar pills, aspirin, injections of salt water, and then meticulously document every single stage of their body's decay. The procedure, as they called it, was just a cold, clinical process of observation. They even performed these excruciatingly painful spinal taps, not to help the men, not for any therapeutic reason, but simply to collect their spinal fluid for the data sets. They wanted to watch neurosyphilis develop in real time. Dr. John Collins and his team, they recorded every rash, every open sore, every tremor, every sign that a man was going blind or losing his mind. Not as a human tragedy to be stopped, but as a data point to be collected. For more than 10 years, this experiment just rolled on, all under the premise that, well, no real cure existed anyway. But then, in the 1940s, a medical miracle happens. Penicillin is discovered. And what the U.S. Public Health Service did next? This is what transforms an already unethical study into something far, far darker. Just look at this timeline. Let's walk through it. The discovery of penicillin wasn't some minor thing. It was a complete 100% cure. In fact, the very same U.S. Public Health Service that was running this experiment started opening rapid treatment centers all across America to wipe out syphilis. But for the men in their study, the men in Tuskegee, that cure was deliberately, systematically withheld. Not for a year, not for 2 years, for 25 more years. They had the cure in their hands, and they chose to hide it. Why? Because their data set wasn't finished yet. So obviously this just shredded every principle of medical ethics, especially this one, informed consent. To keep the men from finding treatment somewhere else, the researchers actively blocked them.
They even used a local black nurse, a woman named Eunice Rivers, to build trust, to become their friend, and to manipulate them into staying in the program. She would tell these men how important they were to science, all while knowing they were being denied a life-saving cure.
Let that quote just sink in for a second. By 1969, this wasn't passive neglect anymore. This was an official, recorded decision. A United States government agency consciously chose to continue the study until every single man was dead. Their ultimate goal was to perform autopsies on them, to harvest the final, complete pathological data from their ravaged bodies. Now, you would probably think that a horror of this scale would have to be some deeply buried, top-level secret, but it wasn't. The Tuskegee study was actually hiding in plain sight. For decades, the researchers published their findings in respected medical journals. The entire medical establishment, we're talking doctors, universities, health officials, they knew. And for decades, they all remained silent. That silence was finally broken in 1972. And it wasn't broken by a doctor or a prestigious university. It was broken by one man, an employee inside the public health service, named Peter Buxton. He saw the pure evil of the study, and when his own internal complaints were just repeatedly ignored and dismissed, he did the only thing he could do. He leaked the whole story to the press. The headline was an absolute explosion. The story triggered immediate and massive public outrage. Finally, the truth of the 40-year experiment was out in the open, forcing congressional investigations and, at long last, an end to the study. But there was no justice. Not really. Sure, a lawsuit was settled for $9 million, but what is that, divided among hundreds of victims and their families, for 40 years of torture? Not a single government official, not one doctor, ever saw the inside of a courtroom, let alone a jail cell. Dr. Cullens? He retired with his pension. Nurse Rivers? She claimed she was just following orders. And Peter Buxton, the man who told the truth? He was ostracized. He never worked in medicine again. The study was over, but the damage was done. The true human cost of this 40-year conspiracy is just staggering, and it created a wound that has been passed down through generations. 128. That's the official number of men who died directly from untreated syphilis or complications from it. 40. That's the number of wives who got the disease from their husbands who had no clue they were even infectious because they believed they were getting treatment from their own government. And 19. 19 children born with congenital syphilis, babies infected in the womb, starting their lives with a disease that was passed to them because of a government experiment. And let's be absolutely clear. As this demographic data shows, this wasn't random. This was medical racism weaponized. They deliberately chose a population that was poor, that had low literacy rates, and that had been systematically stripped of its power. They chose these men because they believed society simply didn't value their lives, and because they knew they could get away with it. The consequences of that choice, they're still echoing today. This one act of betrayal created a deep, justifiable, and incredibly persistent wound of mistrust in the Black community towards the entire medical establishment. You can draw a straight line from Tuskegee to modern-day health disparities to vaccine hesitancy. I mean, how can you trust a system that once treated your people like lab rats? 25 years after the study was exposed, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the nation. The words, they were powerful, sure, but an apology can't bring back the dead. It can't give a man back his sight, and it can't magically heal a wound of mistrust that is still bleeding today. The Tuskegee study is over, but the questions it forces all of us to ask about power, about secrecy, about who our institutions are really built to protect, well, those questions remain. And you have to wonder if they're more urgent today than they have ever been.